Hello and welcome to another episode of Finders Keepers, the podcast that helps you find the best keepers for your keeper and dynasty leagues. I'm your host Jordox, and round 19 of the AFL season was a very high scoring one indeed for the fantasy world. We had 16 players score over 120 and 5 of them went over 140. I feel like the tackling numbers have gone absolutely bananas, which makes sense at this time of the year when things get colder and wetter and the games are slowing down. There were some interesting results across the round, from Carlton finally getting back onto the winners list, the Tigers putting up back-to-back victories, the Dockers in a huge boil over, coming from behind to beat the Pies at the G, and then of course the round finished with the most beautiful sunset, with my Crows delivering a statement performance against Gold Coast. So this week on Finders Keepers, I'm going to go through what I noticed across the round, then I'll jump into the waiver picks, and then we'll finish with a couple of questions sent in from you, the listener. And don't forget, of course, if you want to get involved and you would like a question read out and answered on the podcast, find me on X at FindKeepAFL. So let's get into it. Let's have a look at what I noticed across round 19. And it started on Thursday night with Essendon and the Giants at Marvel. And it was a case of how far for the Giants when you look at all the outs for Essendon. But they were pretty good in the first half. They just couldn't kick straight. And the Giants did what they needed to in the second half. For GWS, Steve Coniglio was a welcome return. He scored a 67, and I think it was a pretty good return. I mean, it's not a big score, of course, but his role looked pretty good. He had a lot of time in the midfield, and I did expect that after a few weeks in the twos, they'd come straight into the midfield mix, particularly with the players that they are missing. Josh Kelly should return next week. I'm not sure who else could be coming back for them, but I'd be surprised if Coniglio wasn't playing midfield for the rest of the season. They're pushing for finals, and if he's fit and ready to go, that's where he'll be. For Essendon, Dylan Shield was back. He had to be back because of all those outs. And he was also straight back into the midfield for the Bombers. He only scored a 70, but I think he did enough to show that he could be a handy player for the back end of the season, especially with that defender status. Archie Perkins came back in as well for Essendon after a week in the twos. He scored a 67. He had some midfield time, but I did expect a bit more. He wasn't one of their main movers in there, and I thought we'd see a little bit more of it, maybe this week. But he looked okay and scored pretty well with a 77, as I said. Friday night was Brisbane and the Bulldogs at the Gabba, and the Doggies really needed to find a way to win this. They hung in there for the whole game, but Brisbane sort of looked always like being too good. Not a lot came out of this game for me. One player for the Lions, Darcy Wilmot, who scored a 69, coming off his big score last week, the 144. He looked set to back that up with a huge first quarter where he scored 41. But he slowed right down and, only finished on 69. Now, Dane Zorko had some issues in this game. First an ankle, then he had a blood rule. He had to get some stitches, I think. Anyway, he was on and off, and it just looked to me like, particularly in that first quarter when Wilmot went big, I think a bit of it was because Zorko was out of the way. And I'm really big on Wilmot, but I just wonder if it's not going to be until the day Dane Zorko retires that we really see Wilmot hit a consistent, higher level of scoring. We know he's got the ceiling now, and he's got the role. It's just old man Zorko has to move out of the way, I think, before Wilmot becomes really dependable and a big scorer. For the Bulldogs, Matt Kennedy was back to normal after a bizarre game last week where he only had 6 touches, scored a 30. Now, he was pretty quiet early in this game, but he got going after quarter time. The role looks fine. He looks fine. He scored a ton. Surely it's just back to normal now for him. On to Saturday, we had Hawks and Port Adelaide in trying conditions in Tasmania. It was wet and windy, and even watching, because the wind was to one side of the screen, right? And just watching when a side was against the wind and they kick it and the ball would sort of almost come back at them. I just haven't seen AFL game in those conditions in a long time. So it was always going to be a pretty hard game to score in. And really it was just about which side handled the conditions better. And Hawks did. They kicked away in the last quarter for an important win. But in terms of fantasy, yeah, it was going to be hard to score other than laying a bunch of tackles. But Josh Ward had the second highest score in his career with a 111. He really thrived in the conditions. He's really looking good with playing on ball. I really hope for his sake and those who own him that they stop trying him outside on the wing. Just keep him at the coalface because he's looking really good in that spot. Dylan Moore has been a hard watch this year for owners. And it's been hard to sort of work out what his problem's been this year. But this game, he reminded us all what he can do on his day with a 143, if you don't mind. Huge score. And nothing really different. He had his usual small smattering of CBAs. There wasn't any big change for him. He just had the ball on a string. And, yeah, owners would be wondering where the heck that's been all season. Jai Newcomb had his colours drastically lowered by the Willem Drew tag. And look, everyone has a dirty day, especially when copping a hard tag, but to only register 2 kicks for the whole game and score 37, really not good enough. And look, he can have these days, Newcomb, but usually he'd at least back it up with a heap of tackles. But that wasn't the case. So really hard score to swallow for owners there. And then the last play was Finn McGuinness, who only scored a 41. But I didn't watch all the game. I watched the last quarter, bits and pieces. But from everything I've read, he did a job on Butters and tagged him to a 76. But he never started at any of the centre bounces. So it must have been a case of... once the centre bounce is done, McGuinness finds his way up the field to run with Butters around the ground. Anyway, if that's the case, did a great job. But he's injured, McGuinness. I think he had a serious or something in his kidney or something internal. So he'll miss some footy, which is probably good news for sides coming up against the Hawks if you're worried about the tag. Nothing really stood out for Port. Let's look at Sydney North, which was the other game, Saturday Arvo. And this game delivered the Finders Keepers Player of the Week, Isaac Heaney, with a career score at age 29. 34 touches, 8 marks, 5 tackles, and 5 goals from the midfield for a whopping 166. Absolutely huge from Heaney. And I'll be honest, I didn't really think he had that sort of score in him. I suppose the 5 goals does help. Brodie Grundy continued his incredible scoring run with a big 129. He was on track for an absolute monster though at 3/4 time because he was on 118. But with the game pretty safe, I think by that stage for the Swans in the last quarter, he was heavily rested in that final quarter and played a bit forward, which really impacted his scoring. So there'll be owners out there who would be disappointed with his 129, which sounds crazy, but against the cherryless North, he was always set for a big one. But there was always that risk that they'd rest him, whether it's in-game or with a sub, because Peter Laddams was the starting sub. I think a few were pretty nervous that he might come on for Grundy in that last quarter. For North, Jai Simpkin, just when just about given up all hope on this guy. I'm a long-time owner and I've been quite frustrated with him this year. He went berserk in the second half. He put on 83 points to finish with 121 for the game. So it's been a very long time since we've seen Simpkin do anything like this. And it's great to see. And did it with 0 centre bounces. So they are absolutely married to the idea of Simpkin as a half-forward flanker, and that is it. Because in recent weeks when LDU and Wardlaw have been out, I thought Simpkin would get a bump. Didn't really happen. And now in this game, he's not even been in the centre bounce once. So, what does that mean? I tell you, if he can score like that, I don't care. And he'll keep forward status. But yeah, I'm still a bit worried about what his scoring output's going to be in the future. Now, as you're aware, Tristan Sherry got the 3-week suspension last week. And there was a lot of talk and speculation about which North rucks would come in to replace him and who of them, if any, were worth having a crack at. So the two names that came in were Bryn Teakle and Callum Coleman-Jones, the ex-Tiger. And they had two fairly opposite days. Poor old Coleman-Jones got injured very early and was subbed out, so he barely got a look in. But that left Teakle to do the bulk of the rucking, and he scored a 95, which is really impressive when you consider the hit-out numbers between the two sides. It was quite extraordinary. I don't think I've ever seen anything like it. Sydney had 80 hit-outs, North Melbourne had 10, which is... yeah, that's a huge discrepancy. But for Teakle himself, he attended 64% of the ruck contests across the field for the game and only registered 5 hit-outs. Yeah, so that's half of what North had. I guess that's something. Anyway, being around the ball helped him, and he had 6 tackles, kicked a goal, scored 95. And he's got forward status. He doesn't have ruck status, just a forward. I think it's pretty handy if you grabbed him or maybe look at it this week. The other thing about that is, though, young Taylor Goad impressed in the VFL. He's the 20-year-old ruck that North have that last week, I mean, I said he wasn't ready. That's what it seemed like. But with the way Teakle performed, with respect to him, I think there's a pretty good chance they bring Goad in. Not to replace Teakle. I think Teakle still plays, but just to have the two. They're playing Geelong. So Geelong have the 2 rucks at the minute. So I think, well, they've got Stanley and a couple of helpers. Anyway, I think Teakle plays with Goad, and yeah, hopefully they can get a few more hit-outs this week. Last player, Will Phillips. Look, just a 71. His scoring isn't setting the world on fire, but I've just noticed those high centre bounce numbers the last few weeks, and he's scored around 70 each time. He's probably just one to keep an eye on. We know that he's got a lot of... it was a high draft pick. Just hasn't had anywhere near the career, I'm sure he'd been hoping to this stage. But, these guys, they can pop later in life. So let's see what he can do. In fact, yeah, he's only 23, so it could still happen for him. On to the Saturday night games, and these look like good games. I missed them both because I was out. The first one, Carlton-Melbourne. Geez, Carlton needed a win, and this looked like it was pretty close all game, but obviously Carlton held on in the end. Ashton Moyer has had a very impressive run since returning to the side in the last, 3-4 weeks. And he hasn't really scored plenty, but I've watched a lot of Carlton games, and he's stood out every time I watch. There's something about him. He looks a player, and his role is really interesting because he plays forward, I think deep forward, but then he also seems to have centre bounces in games as well. So in this game, looked like he played very well, kicked 4 goals, and was probably the X factor, really, a big reason why the Blues won. Only scored 67 points, which isn't a lot if you've kicked 4 goals. But I reckon he's someone that is going to continue to improve, and we'll be talking about him a bit in fantasy circles, probably in the next few years, I reckon. Adam Sard returned to the side after a few weeks out and scored a 49. Not sure how relevant he is these days. But I talk about him because there are other guys we'd like to see maybe in that role, or who are in that role, who take kick-ins. And Sard came in and took pretty much all of them this week. But amazingly, he didn't play on half the time. So he took 8 kick-ins and only played on 3 times. So clearly, Sard himself doesn't care about fantasy anymore. For Melbourne, Just the one guy, Keziah Pickett, with 106. I mean, what a season he's having. What a role he's playing. It's the third time this season he's kicked 5 goals in a game playing predominantly midfield. It's unbelievable. I'm really not hearing people talk about him enough in terms of the season he's had. But yeah, another ton for Cozzy, and owners would be very happy. The later game was West Coast Richmond, and I wish I was watching because it looked close in the first half, and then Richmond just went bang, kicked 8 goals in the third quarter, blew the game out of the park. For the Eagles, pretty down night for them. Brady Hoff scored another ton, just continues that up and down scoring that he has done this year. But the exciting one was Harley Reid with back-to-back tons and just looking like he has arrived in the fantasy world. A 117, and for the second week in a row was on around 65 at half-time, and the other side has had to throw a tag at him in the second half. So it's exciting to see. He's only in his second year, Reid, and who knows what his ceiling will be in the fantasy world, but just nice to see him get those tons on the board. For Richmond, there was a lot to like, and I tell you what, for all the talk about Tim Taranto and Jacob Hopper and, the huge contracts, long contracts that they got at the Tigers through, injury, form, and just the challenge of playing with such a young side, they haven't really lived up to it just yet. Taranto maybe in his first season. Anyway, the point is, this was, I reckon, the best game we've seen the two of them play together. And, I mean, you just look at the numbers. They scored 124, 127 fantasy scores, Taranto and Hopper. 63 touches between them and 5 goals between them from the midfield as well, which, huge numbers. So if those two can stay fit and perform like that Richmond rebuild is really going to accelerate. Jack Ross is, he's an interesting guy, Ross. I was really big on him in pre-season and for most of this year, and then I kind of gave up. But the thing with Ross is, if he gets an inside role, he scores. If he gets an outside role, he can score, but then there's just pockets of games where he goes completely missing. But since Kane McAuliffe went out of the side a few weeks ago, Ross has gone into the middle, and just in the last couple of weeks as well has started to do some tagging roles, which have been good for the side and good for his scoring. So we got a 101 on the weekend, and it was his biggest centre bounce game of the season, and scored accordingly. Another 9 tackles, so he's laid 25 tackles in the last 3 games. And yeah, like I said, was once again used on the opposition's best mid. He went to Merritt last week at halftime, and he went to Harley Reid at halftime this week. Great signs for him. The first of the 3 Sunday games was Geelong and St Kilda, down at Geelong, and looks like St Kilda were pretty brave to hang in there for most of the day, but Geelong with a comfortable 5-goal win. Sean Manor has been not a revelation, but he's been an inspired pick for those that grabbed him in drafts or keepers this year. And he put up a 144 against St Kilda. Just a monster performance thanks to kicking 3 goals and laying 11 tackles. Just playing a great role. Obviously, he hasn't scored anything like that before, but he's been very consistent this year and a great own. Brian Myers put up a pretty good score with 89. But what was interesting was Geelong's use of him at the centre bounces. So he took Ocean Mullen's spot at the centre bounces with 44% of them this week. And that's the first time he's been used in there all season. I'm not sure what they were doing. They were trying something different with Myers. Does that continue? Not sure. But I found the use of Mullen to be quite interesting because he's been used at centre bounces to tag in this year. He's become quite a good tagger. But not this week. He didn't attend any centre bounces, and I don't think he was tagging anyone. And that's kind of weird because Wayne Miller, who I'll talk about for the Saints in a moment, had his biggest midfield game of the year. So I wonder if they'd known that, Geelong, would they have kept Mullen in the middle and tried to tag Wanganeen Miller, who I'll talk about now is the hottest player in the game. He put up a 151. And it's funny, like, my only thing with him as of 5-6 weeks ago was, does he have a ceiling? Since then, he's shown that he absolutely does. And this was his biggest midfield game for the year. He spent the most amount of time he spent at centre bounces, and he just went berserk. He was on 67 at quarter time, and ended on 151. Just incredible stuff from him. Jack Steele continues his great form. He's now scored 90 plus in 11 of his last 12 games. And in that run includes 9 tons, which he got on the weekend with a 119, which was a touch underwhelming because his halftime score, I think he was on 88 at halftime. And as an owner, I was, dreaming of the 150 that Wanganeen Miller got. He did slow down, but 119 is still a great score. His tackle numbers have been insane the last 3 weeks, and that's historically what Jack Steele has been, a big tackler. But he's averaging 14 a game in his last 3. And I just think it's that wet, colder weather that, seems to be suiting him and the way he plays. So watch for him to have a big finish to the year. And then lastly, Rowan Marshall scored a nice 104, which is pretty good when you look at how much he split the ruck with young Heath. It was a 59-41% split for ruck contests around the ground. Marshall was preferred at the centre bounces, but Heath getting plenty of it around the ground. So for Marshall to hit a 104, I think that's pretty good. We'll see what happens in the last 5-6 weeks of the year with that role and how much they use Heath. On to Collingwood and Freo at the G, and what an upset this was. Huge result for Freo, coming back to win by a point. And they are looking like one of the form sides as we get closer to finals. But for the fantasy side of things, Nick Dacos continued the weekend of whopper scores with a 162, thanks to 43 touches. And he started the game, I saw that he started or played bits of this game at half back, perhaps swapping with his brother. And he got a lot of the pill playing behind the ball, which, that's what he did in his first year from memory. He was at halfback. Anyway, interesting to see Collingwood trying that. And Josh Dacos, he scored 85, and I thought he'd play a little bit more midfield after last week's effort. He was in there at times, I guess probably, swapping with his brother. I just thought it'd be a little bit more, considering how effective he was in that role last week. Beau McCreary, he was back from a few weeks out, I think, and had 44% centre bounces, which took me by surprise. And he laid 15 tackles, which is huge. So he scored 98. That's what caught my eye. Once I saw it was off 15 tackles, I probably cooled a little bit on him. But I remember earlier in the year, I think before he had another injury, watching him play in that midfield role, he did look pretty good. Whether the scoring is there or not, I guess time will tell. For Fremantle, Patrick Voss is someone that's caught my eye a lot this season. But sort of any time I've gone to grab him or even talk about him, the scoring just hasn't been there. But he's just yet another one of those key forwards developing, and you can just see being a safe 70 guy for your forward line down the track. And this was his first big fantasy score. He scored a 93 thanks to kicking 6 goals. I mean, that's a cracking effort against Darcy Moore. Kicking 6. Yeah, he's looking really good. And I think Josh Tracy's trailed off a little bit in form this year. In recent times anyway. So important that Voss does step up and continue to play well. It was great to see Hayden Young return. The guy's had so many injuries. Hopefully he gets a really good run at it now. He was the starting sub, which was a little bit interesting. You thought if they weren't going to give him a full game, maybe just put him in the waffle. But, they started him as a sub and came on and looked pretty good. Scored 39 from just 28% time on ground. Had, I think, 11 touches and was pretty important for the Dockers in that last quarter. So I reckon he'll be starting properly next week in the guts, and yeah, hopefully he can get some scores on the board. And then the last game, which was really enjoyable to watch for me, Adelaide and Gold Coast. It was a strange game, really. The Suns were goalless at halftime, but they were playing pretty well. I mean, all the stats would have suggested it was a tight game. It's just the Crows were super efficient and the Suns were super inefficient going forward. For the Crows, not a lot of their stars sort of stood out in a big win, and that just talks about how even this side has been this year. That's why the fantasy scoring hasn't always been with high scores. It's just been lots of decent scores. And this was the same. I mean, Rankin, who I'll talk about now, but also Thilthorpe and even Dawson, a few of the stars were a little bit down, and it didn't matter because the side still played well. Anyway, Rankin, he scored 66, kicked a couple of goals. I'm getting really worried about his role, and I think I'm late to the party because I know certainly in the salary cap formats where he was a popular pick, a lot of people have jumped off because his centre bounces have been starting to have been decreasing. I've been pretty confident that he'll still be fine and he'll still get plenty of time in there, but on the weekend he only attended 2 centre bounces for the whole game, which is the lowest since we've seen him in this hybrid role. And I don't know, I still like him in there. I'm not sure why he's just forward at the minute, but we'll see what the Crows do in the coming weeks. Chase Jones was the starting sub for the Crows, and he came on for Mitch Hinge, who went off in the second quarter. Now, Jones scored 32, nothing to get too excited about, but he had a bunch of centre bounces in the second half. So while I talk about Rankin not being in the centre, it's equally surprising to see Jones in that role, because when he came on for Hinge, it's a pretty like-for-like winger, half-back type. But interesting to see the Crows looking at Jones in the middle. Alex Neil-Bullen, he was a player of the game. It was certainly his best game as a Crow, and maybe even his best ever game. 135 he scored, thanks to 31 touches and 3 goals playing half forward. And he was just everywhere. His pressure and setting up teammates and then finishing himself. It was a complete game from him. For Gold Coast, Sam Flanders continues to improve from a very low base, must be said. Some of his scoring this season has been, borderline barely fieldable at times. But he's been great since the bye, and he put up a 107, his first ton of the year, despite not getting much or any centre bounce bump, which I had perhaps anticipated with Took Miller out that someone would get a few more, whether it would be him or Fiorini. But it really was just Bailey Humphrey who got that centre bounce bump, and he was very quiet, certainly didn't score in a way that would suggest he was increasing his centre bounces. But yeah, great for Flanders. He's just all over the ground, taking lots of marks. He looks a lot freer, and he's going to have forward status next year. So yeah, I think as bad as this year's been for those who own Flanders, they can be pretty optimistic about the future still. Connor Broderick is he's an interesting guy. I really thought he was a chance to break out in that half-back role. Even last season, I think it was, before John Noble, Dan Rioli came across. And it didn't happen, and he's just been injured, and I think he's been playing fairly lockdown type roles, so his scoring hasn't been anything that you'd want. But on the weekend, Dan Rioli did get injured, was unfortunately subbed out at half time, and then Broderick put up 68 points in the second half to finish on 92. Which I think is really interesting, and I'm looking forward to watching them this week and see if that continues. Because I remember I'm pretty sure it was when Damien Hardwick first came to Gold Coast, I remember a quote from him saying he's big on Broderick and he likes him in the Jaden Short type role. I've never forgotten that because I was so big on him after hearing that. And it could still happen. And lastly, Braden Fiorini, he just deserves to be talked about again. He's just having a great run. Scored a 101 and just continues to impress me playing mostly wing. I didn't think he could score off the wing, but he hasn't dropped under 87 since round 12 and is averaging 95 in that 6-week period, which is pretty good. If you snapped him up off the waiver wire 6 weeks ago, you'd be pretty pleased with that return. All right, well, speaking of the waivers, let's have a look at this week's waiver picks. And I'll begin by looking at last week's waiver picks and who I suggested to grab and how they went. Now, I'm only doing 4 at this stage of the year because it is drying up out there. So last week I suggested maybe take a punt on Tom Brown from Richmond. He was at 39% ownership. Looks like he's going to be a pretty good scorer at some point, and he popped a good one last week, but yeah, not the weekend just gone. Just at 56. I still like him, but yeah, the scoring's probably just not going to be there yet, particularly with Jaden Short still there and the huge breakout that we're seeing for Sam Banks. Another guy was Sam Swikowski for Freo. He was at 35% last week. Look, no goals this week, but still managed a 69 against the Pies at the G. I think that's pretty good. And I think if you grabbed him, you wouldn't be too disappointed with that. You would be probably a little bit with the next guy, Manny Liddy. I liked him last week. I just felt like he's pretty safe for 70s off a wing. This just wasn't his day. The wet conditions did not suit him. He barely got a touch and then was subbed out on 16. Would I hold him if I grabbed him? Oh, look, I reckon you'd want to have another look. It's probably more a case of do Port hold him this week, or do they send him back to the twos? I thought he was pretty safe in the side, but they weren't. They didn't hesitate to drop him the other week. So, yeah, he's probably going to be out. And based on that, I reckon you could probably let him go. And then the last one was Dylan Shield, who was only at 60% owned and was, I imagine, a pretty popular pick. In fact, he was. His ownership's gone up to 78% in a week. So he came in, played predominantly midfield, and just scored a 70. I think if you grabbed him, you're going to be pretty happy to keep playing him. And the fact that Essendon have all these early games, they played Thursday night last week. I think they might be Thursday again this week or Friday. Anyway, he's a great loophole guy. Chuck him in at D6. Have a look. If you like the score, you take it. And if you don't, you don't. But I just think in that role, he's going to score better than 70 most weeks. Nothing too exciting from my guys last week. Let's see if I can do a bit better this week. So I'll start with Blake Hardwick from Hawthorn. He's played a lot of the season up forward and has got that defender forward status, which is very handy. But the last 6 weeks, he's really just been playing in the back line again, where he does score better. And look, he hasn't. There was a 75 a couple of weeks ago, but on the weekend, he put up a really good score with a 114 thanks to 27 touches and 8 marks in the wet. That's pretty impressive. Took a couple of kick-ins. Look, he's a bit of a risk, but I don't know. Weddle's out of the side, and he's clearly back there again in the back line. I reckon you could do worse than having a go at him. Beau McCreary, I spoke about him earlier for Collingwood. He's only owned in 9% of leagues, which I found quite surprising, just because he's looked okay at times in that midfield role. Now, his 98 on the weekend was great, but it did come from 15 tackles, which you'd argue would be hard to replicate week to week, but I don't mind him, and that's a very low ownership. It's not a terrible guy to have a crack at. Bryn Teakle is another one for North, who I actually thought would have been picked up by a lot more coaches last week when he was named up as the ruck replacement for Cherry. He's only owned in 8% of leagues. Scored 95, very nice score, barely got a hit out, but I think they'll bring in young Goad to maybe help him this week. And yeah, forward status, he's only 25 years old. Why not? And then the last guy is Connor Budrick, who's only owned in 19% of leagues, which again surprised me. He's just been, he's been disappointing the last 2 seasons. And he hasn't been scoring well at all this year. The role hasn't been great either. I think he's been kind of locked down in the back line, but I looked before, he's been playing forward a bit as well. Anyway, on the weekend, Dan Rioli went down. Budrick seemed to go into his role and had a big second half. So if they persist with that, Budrick at only 19% ownership, I think he's still only 23, 24 years old. Yeah, 24. Yeah, he's definitely worth a waiver wire this week. So there's my 4, but as I do every week, I like to go a little bit deeper and look at players with even smaller ownership to help you out if you play in a very, very deep league. And here's some guys you can consider. Jake Stringer, 27% ownership. Hasn't really looked at this year, but the last 2 weeks he's looked a lot better. Certainly helped the Giants in the last game. So he's hitting a bit of form as they approach finals. I think he's definitely worth having a look at. Another guy is Tom Cole for West Coast, who's at 22% ownership, and he's someone that's teased in the past as being fantasy friendly. I'd be hesitant to invest and be really confident that he would, but he's scored in 3 of his last 40. He's put up 80s. So he's obviously playing a nicer role and getting the ball. Will it continue? I don't know, but at 22% ownership in a very deep league, he'd be worth grabbing. Same goes for Patrick Voss for Freo. He's at 13% ownership, and that's going to spike after the big score on the weekend. So definitely try and get him into your side. And then the last one would be Ashton Moyer for Carlton, 8% ownership. Again, hasn't put up any big scores, but if you've watched Carlton play, you would have noticed him. And he kicked 4 on the weekend, and I think he's worth investing in. All right, I'll jump into the listener questions now and then wrap up the pod for this week. If you are enjoying the pod and have enjoyed it in its first season, please make sure you've liked and subscribed wherever you're listening. And of course, go and follow on X at FindKeepAFL. First question is from @HawkersHeroes on X, who is a big supporter of the pod. Thank you, mate. Love your work. And his question this week is a good one. He's asked, do you think Josh Ward, Darcy Wilmot, Levi Ashcroft and Joel Freya can average 85 plus next season? It's a good question. It's 4 great names, and I'll go through them in a moment. I guess the short answer is yes. I think all of them can, but whether I think they will is probably a different thing. Let's start with Josh Ward. He's currently averaging 78, and just in recent times, we've seen him on the inside, showing the scoring abilities that he does have. I could really see him having a big breakout next year. So I'd be tipping him to go above 85. I could see him averaging 90 next year, Josh Ward, if all goes well. So it's a yes for him. Darcy Wilmot's a trickier one. He's averaging 77 currently, having a great year, and he's very reliable. And we saw on the weekend he can put up big scores but then go very quiet for quarters, and that's what he did. I think at a stretch he could get to 85 next year, at a stretch, but I think his ceiling average will be more when Dane Zorko retires, which I don't think is going to happen at this stage. He's playing on next year as far as I know. So I'm going to say no to Wilmot averaging 85 next year. I reckon he can get above 80, but yeah, until Zorko's out of the picture, I think that just dents his ceiling. Levi Ashcroft is the next one. He's averaging 75 currently. I can see him going to 90 next year if he moves into the midfield. I mean, you've got to look at this guy. He's a first-year player. He's averaging 75 with some, I don't know how many sub-affected games. There's been at least one. But he's on a 75 average his first year, and he hasn't been in the middle once. Not one centre bounce. So yes, I think he does go over 85 and can even hit 90 next year, but we have to see him start to move into the midfield for that to happen. And I'm not sure whether it will happen. I mean, they've just still got so much in there. Do we finally see Lachie Neale start to transition out and Levi in? Not sure if that's next year, but yeah, at some point Levi will go into the guts and he'll be huge. So can he do it next year? I'm going to say yes. And then the last one was Joel Freya for the Bulldogs. So he's had an interesting year. I mean, he's averaging 73, which is excellent for a second-year player. I'm not sure if he gets to 85 next year, though. I just think he needs to be settled into one role. I mean, this year we've seen him play off half-back. We've seen him in the middle. We've seen him half-forward. He's been all over the ground, and yeah, the scoring consistency hasn't been there. I reckon he can average 80 next year. I reckon he might just fall short of 85. But down the track, in a few more years, if he becomes a permanent mid, which I can see him doing, yeah, he's going to be a great scorer and certainly someone I'd like to have in my side. But until he lands or settles on that role, it's kind of hard to call it. So Ward, yes. Wilmot, no. Ashcroft, yes. Freya, no. They're my thoughts on whether those four players will average 85 plus next season. Great question from Hawker. They are all interesting guys, aren't they? I think the final thing I'd say on those four names is I'd be very happy to own any of them, particularly Ashcroft. All right, last question, and it's from Bales. At Bales DT, the man, the host of AFL Fantasy Fanatics, which is another podcast that I am on, but Bales is the man. And he messaged me this during the week. I don't even think he knows this is on the pod. I don't even know if he listens to this pod. Anyway, he pulled off a trade in his Dynasty League, and it went like this. Zorko and Fiorini out for Horne-Francis and Langford in. And that's Kyle Langford, not Harvey. So Zorko and Fiorini out for Horne-Francis and Kyle Langford. I don't know if Bales is contending. I'm guessing he's not. In fact, yeah, he wouldn't be because Horne-Francis is out for the year and he's brought him in. I think it's a brilliant trade. I think Zorko, yes, is one of the best defenders you can have, but you feel like there's a limit, an expiration date on this scoring from Zorko just due to his age. And Fiorini's your perfect, trade him while they're hot. He's in good form. Get him out the door. And to bring Horne-Francis in, who I think is going to be one of the best fantasy players long-term going round. Kyle Langford's just your steak knives, whether you even keep him or not. So basically, Horne-Francis in for Zorko and Fiorini, I think, is a great trade. Bales, well done. That's really well played. And as someone who owns Horne-Francis in one of my keepers, yes, I'm spewing that he's out for the season, but I wouldn't be letting him go for very much at all. So well played, Bales. And that's it. Just a couple of questions this week. Try and get some more for next week. Don't forget you can send in trades like Bales has just done to get me to sort of analyse it for you on the pod. And it should be a pretty busy time. I know trade deadlines are approaching for many leagues, and there's a lot to consider at this time of the year because we are approaching the end of the season, which for all the other formats means see you later. But for us keeper and dynasty coaches, well, that's a big part of the game, is that list management, getting those trades done, working out who you're delisting, and then ultimately preparing for the draft in the new year or whenever your leagues do it. So there's a lot going on. I'm sure you've got plenty of things to consider for your sides. Send it in to me and I'll go through it on the pod for you. But that's it for this week. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I've helped you with your sides, and good luck for the week ahead. I hope you get all the players you desire from the waiver wire, and I hope all the sides you coach get up on the weekend and you have a very successful round 20. I'll be back next week on Tuesday to look back at round 20 and try and make sense of it all for you. So I'll chat to you then. But in the meantime, I'm Jordox. This has been Finders Keepers. And until next time, keep on keeping on.